Tonight, we will follow the long history of the lands we now call Ukraine. We will begin far before written records. We will move slowly through ancient settlements, steppe peoples, medieval cities, kingdoms, empires, revolutions, wars, and the final years of the Soviet Union. This is a very long journey. You do not need to remember every name or every date. You may simply listen as the centuries pass quietly by. And if you fall asleep somewhere along the way, that is perfectly all right. The history of Ukraine does not begin with a single founding moment. There was no morning when one people suddenly appeared and gave the land its modern name. Instead, the story begins with geography. Ukraine lies between several different worlds. To the north are forests and marshes. To the south is the open grassland of the Pontic steppe. In the west rise the Carpathian Mountains. Through the center and east flow large rivers, including the Dnipro, the Southern Bug, the Donets, and above all the Dunets. The Dnipro runs from the forests of northern Europe toward the Black Sea. For thousands of years it served as a road of water. People traveled along it. Goods moved along it. Armies followed it. Settlements grew beside it. The broad steppe of southern Ukraine also formed a kind of road. It had no stone pavement and no marked borders. It was a road made of grass and sky. Herds could move across it for hundreds of kilometers. Horsemen could travel quickly from east to west. This made the land open to exchange, migration, and invasion. It also made the region unusually diverse. Long before cities and kingdoms, small groups of hunters lived here during the final stages of the Ice Age. Some of the oldest traces of human activity in the region are tens of thousands of years old. Archaeologists have found stone tools, animal bones, campsites, and shelters made partly from the bones of mammoths. At sites such as Mezhyrich in central Ukraine, people built circular structures using large mammoth bones. These shelters date from roughly 15,000 years ago. The landscape was colder then. Much of the region was open tundra or cold grassland. Mammoths, reindeer, wild horses, and other large animals moved through it. Human communities were small. They survived by hunting, gathering plants, making tools, and sharing knowledge across generations. Their names are lost. Their languages are unknown. But the objects they left behind remind us that human life in these lands reaches far beyond written history. As the climate became warmer, forests expanded, and animal populations changed. People adapted. They hunted smaller animals, caught fish, gathered seeds and berries, and settled for longer periods near rivers and lakes. Then, several thousand years before the Common Era, farming communities began to appear. One of the best-known prehistoric cultures connected with the territory of Ukraine is called the Cucuteni Trypillia culture. It existed from roughly 5,000 to 3,000 years before the Common Era. Its settlements stretched across parts of modern Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania. The people of this culture grew crops, raised animals, made pottery, and built houses from timber and clay. Some of their settlements were surprisingly large. A few may have contained thousands of buildings, arranged in wide circles or oval patterns. Sites such as Talyanki and Maidanetsky covered areas larger than many later medieval towns. These settlements were not cities in the modern sense. They had no stone palaces, written administration, or permanent royal institutions that we know of, but their scale shows that prehistoric farming communities could organize large and complex spaces. Trypillia pottery was often decorated with spirals, curved lines, and geometric patterns. Some vessels were painted in red, black, and white. Small clay figures have also been found. Their meaning is uncertain. Some may have represented people, spirits, ancestors, or symbols connected with family life and fertility. Archaeologists continue to debate their purpose. Many Trypillia houses were eventually burned. For a long time, researchers wondered whether these settlements had been destroyed by enemies. Today, many archaeologists believe that at least some houses were deliberately burned as part of a repeated cultural practice. A community might use a house for a generation, then burn it and rebuild elsewhere. The reasons are not fully understood. The burning may have marked the end of the household cycle. It may have been connected with ritual. It may also have helped clear old structures. Scientists still discuss this, and that uncertainty is part of the distant past. While farming communities lived in the forest steppe, other societies developed on the open grasslands farther south and east. The steppe favored herding. Cattle, sheep, goats, and later horses could move across large distances in search of pasture. During the 4th and 3rd millennia before the Common Era, communities associated with what archaeologists call the Yamnaya culture lived across much of the Pontic-Caspian steppe. The word Yamnaya comes from a term meaning pit, because the dead were often buried in pits beneath earthen mounds. These burial mounds are known as kurgans. Thousands of kurgans once rose above the steppe. Some remain visible today as gentle hills and fields. The Yamnaya communities used wheeled vehicles and practiced mobile herding. They moved animals over wide territories. Genetic and linguistic research has connected populations of the Pontic-Caspian steppe with major migrations into Europe and parts of Asia. Many scholars believe that these migrations helped spread early Indo-European languages. The exact relationship between archaeology, ancestry, and language is complex. A burial style does not always represent one people. A genetic population does not always speak one language. Ancient identity was not organized in the same way as modern nationality. Still, the steppe north of the Black Sea played an important role in one of the great movements of prehistoric humanity. Later, the use of horses became even more important. The horse changed distance. A journey that might take many days on foot could be completed more quickly. Herds could be managed across broader areas. Warriors could move with speed. For centuries, political power in the steppe would often belong to societies skilled in riding, herding, and mounted warfare. By the 1st millennium before the Common Era, written sources began to describe some of the peoples living in and around the region. One early group known from Greek and Assyrian sources was the Cimmerians. They lived north of the Black Sea during the early centuries of the 1st millennium before the Common Era. The details of their society remain uncertain. They appear in ancient accounts as mobile warriors, and some groups moved south into Anatolia and the Near East. After them came the Scythians. The Scythians were not a single unified nation in the modern sense. They were groups of related steppe peoples with similar languages, customs, and styles of material culture. They became powerful in the region from around the 7th century before the Common Era. Much of what we know about them comes from archaeology and from ancient Greek writers, especially Herodotus. Herodotus described Scythian customs, warfare, burial practices, and geography. Some of his information may have been accurate. Some may have been misunderstood or exaggerated. Ancient historians often mixed observation with rumor. Archaeology provides another view. Scythian burial mounds have contained weapons, horse equipment, jewelry, imported Greek pottery, and carefully made objects of gold. Their art often showed animals. Deer, eagles, panthers, horses, and mythical creatures appear in curved and compact forms. This animal style was not simply decorative. It may have expressed ideas about power, movement, death, and the natural world. Some Scythian rulers were buried beneath enormous kurgans. The burials could include horses, attendants, weapons, and precious goods. These graves reveal strong social differences. Some people lived as ordinary herders or farmers. Others belonged to an elite able to command labor and collect valuable objects from distant places. The Scythian world was connected to the Greek world along the Black Sea coast. Beginning around the 7th and 6th centuries before the Common Era, Greek settlers founded colonies in the region. These included Olbia, near the mouth of the southern Bug, Chersonesus near modern Sevastopol, and settlements in eastern Crimea and around the Sea of Azov. The colonies traded with the peoples of the interior. Grain, fish, salt, animals, hides, and enslaved people moved toward Mediterranean markets. Wine, pottery, metal goods, oil, and luxury objects moved north. The Black Sea was not a distant edge of the ancient world. It was part of a busy network. Ships crossed its waters. Merchants kept accounts. Craftspeople worked in towns surrounded by walls. Temples stood near harbors. In Olbia, residents used small bronze objects shaped like dolphins as a form of currency. In Chersonesus, farmers cultivated the surrounding countryside in carefully divided plots. Greek language and religion flourished in these cities, but the colonies were never isolated from their neighbors. People met, traded, intermarried, fought, and influenced one another. The steppe and the coast formed two different environments, but they remained closely connected. Scythian power weakened after the 4th century before the Common Era. New groups entered the region, including the Sarmatians. Like the Scythians, the Sarmatians were Iranian-speaking steppe peoples. They became influential from roughly the 3rd century before the Common Era. Ancient writers sometimes describe Sarmatian women as riders and warriors. Archaeologists have indeed found female burials containing weapons, though this does not mean that every woman fought or that Sarmatian society was ruled entirely by women. The evidence simply shows that women could hold roles more varied than ancient stereotypes sometimes suggest. Over the following centuries, control of the northern Black Sea region shifted repeatedly. The Roman Empire influenced some coastal cities and parts of Crimea. The Bosporan Kingdom, centered around the Kerch Strait, combined Greek traditions with local and steppe influences. It survived in different forms for many centuries. Farther inland, communities farmed, traded, and adapted to changing powers. In the first centuries of the Common Era, groups associated with the Goths moved into areas north of the Black Sea. The Goths were Germanic-speaking peoples whose origins and migrations were complex. Some established political power in the region during the 3rd and 4th centuries. They interacted with local populations, the Roman world, and neighboring steppe groups. Then came the Huns. In the late 4th century, Hunnic expansion disrupted the political order north of the Black Sea. Some Goths fled toward Roman territory. Others remained or joined new alliances. The Huns themselves were a confederation rather than a single simple ethnic group. Their armies included peoples of different origins. This was common in the steppe. Political loyalty could be more important than ancestry. Successful rulers gathered warriors, families, and subject communities around them. When power weakened, these confederations could break apart. After the death of Attila in the 5th century, Hunnic power declined. Other steppe peoples followed. Among them were the Avars, Bulgars, Khazars, Pechenegs, and later the Cumans, also known as the Polovstians. Their names appear one after another in written histories, but the process was rarely a complete replacement of one population by another. Some groups moved away, some were absorbed, some changed language or political loyalty. Some remained in villages while new rulers collected tribute above them. Across the forest and forest steppe zones, Slavic-speaking communities gradually became more visible in archaeological and written records. The early history of the Slavs is debated. They did not emerge from one clearly defined point, and they left few written accounts of their own. By the 6th century, Byzantine authors described groups called the Sclaveni and Ants living north of the Danube and around parts of the northern Black Sea region. These communities practiced farming and lived in relatively small settlements. They grew grain, raised animals, gathered forest products, and used rivers for travel. Their houses were often partly dug into the ground, which helped provide insulation during cold winters. Political organization was usually local. A village or group of villages might be guided by elders, military leaders, or assemblies. Larger alliances could form during war. Over time, Slavic-speaking populations spread across much of Eastern and Central Europe. The ancestors of Ukrainians, Belarusians, Russians, Poles, Slovaks, and several South Slavic peoples emerged from this broad and changing world. There was no clear line separating future nations. Languages changed gradually from place to place. Customs overlapped. Identity belonged to family, settlement, ruler, faith, and local region long before it belonged to a modern nation. In the 7th and 8th centuries, the Khazar Khaganate became a major power in the steppe and around the lower Volga and Don. The Khazars controlled important trade routes. Goods moved between northern Europe, the Islamic world, Byzantium, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. Khazar rulers collected tribute from several neighboring peoples, including some Slavic communities. At some point, part of the Khazar ruling elite adopted Judaism. The scale and nature of this conversion remain debated, but it made the Khazar state unusual among the political powers of the region. The Khazar period shows how closely the lands of present-day Ukraine were tied to wider networks. Silver coins from the Islamic world have been found far to the north. Furs, wax, honey, weapons, and enslaved people traveled south. Silk, coins, jewelry, and other goods traveled north and west. The rivers were the main roads. The Dnipro was especially important. By the 8th and 9th centuries, Scandinavian traders and warriors began traveling along Eastern European river systems. They are often called Varangians in the sources. In Western Europe, similar people were known as Vikings or Norsemen. They sailed from the Baltic Sea into rivers leading south. Their shallow boats could move through narrow waterways. When necessary, boats and goods were carried over land from one river system to another. One route connected the Baltic world with the Black Sea and Constantinople. It became known as the route from the Varangians to the Greeks. Along this route, Scandinavian newcomers encountered Slavic, Finnic, Baltic, Turkic, and other communities. They traded, collected tribute, fought, settled, and gradually became part of local society. Out of this mixture emerged the medieval polity known as Rus. The origins of Rus have been debated for centuries. Some historians once argued fiercely over whether the state was primarily created by Scandinavian outsiders or by local Slavic development. Today, most scholars view the process as a combination. Scandinavian military and trading groups played an important role, especially in early ruling networks. But they operated within a densely populated local world. They adopted local languages and customs. Their descendants became part of an East Slavic political and cultural society. The word Rus itself may have Scandinavian origins, though this too has been discussed. The primary chronicle, written in Kyiv in the early 12th century, tells a story about Varangian rulers being invited to govern northern towns. It names a figure called Rurik. Whether every detail is historical is uncertain. The chronicle was written centuries after the earliest events. Its authors shaped the past to explain the political order of their own time. Rurik became associated with a dynasty that ruled many Rus principalities for generations. Another important figure was Oleg, known in some traditions as Ole. According to the chronicle, Oleg took control of Kyiv in the late 9th century. He is said to have declared Kyiv the mother of Rus cities. Kyiv's location was favorable. It stood above the Dnipro on high ground. The river connected it to the Baltic in the north and the Black Sea in the south. Nearby forests, fields, and tributaries supported a large population. Kyiv was not founded by the Varangians. People had lived in the area for centuries. But under the rulers of Rus, it became the center of a growing political network. The early princes collected tribute from surrounding tribes and communities. This system was sometimes called poludi. A prince and his armed retinue traveled through subject territories, receiving furs, wax, honey, food, silver, and other goods. The relationship could be violent. Communities resisted excessive demands. Prince Ihor, known in some languages as Igor, was killed in the 10th century after attempting to collect additional tribute from the Drevlians. According to the primary chronicle, his widow, Princess Olha, then took revenge. The account describes a series of elaborate punishments. Some parts may be literary rather than strictly factual. But Olha was certainly a significant ruler. She reorganized tribute collection by establishing more regular places and amounts of payment. This reduced dependence on the prince's personal journey. Olha also visited Constantinople and accepted Christianity. She was later recognized as a saint. Her son, Sviatoslav, remained a pagan and became known for military campaigns. Sviatoslav fought against the Khazars, Volga Bulgars, and Balkan powers. His destruction of major Khazar centers in the 10th century changed the balance of power in the steppe, but military expansion carried risks. Sviatoslav was killed by Pechenegs near the Dnipro rapids in the early 970s. The Pecheneg ruler was said to have made a drinking cup from his skull. This detail may reflect a steppe ritual, or it may have been added to emphasize the dramatic end of a warrior prince. After struggles among Sviatoslav's sons, Vladimir gained control of Kyiv. He is known as Vladimir gained control of Kyiv. He is known as Vladimir the Great. His reign marked one of the most important turning points in the history of Rus. At first, Vladimir supported traditional pagan worship. The chronicle says that he placed images of several gods on a hill in Kyiv. Among them was Perun, associated with thunder and warfare, yet the Rus state was becoming more connected to Christian powers. Christian communities already existed in Kyiv. Princess Olha had converted. Merchants and diplomats traveled to Christian cities. In the late 10th century, Vladimir chose Byzantine Christianity. The traditional date for the Christianization of Rus is 998. The event was political, cultural, and religious. According to the chronicle, Vladimir considered several faiths before choosing the Christianity of Constantinople. The story may have been shaped to present the decision as wise and deliberate. The real process probably involved negotiations with the Byzantine emperors and Volodimir's marriage to a Byzantine princess named Anna. Volodymyr was baptized. He then ordered the people of Kyiv to enter the waters of the Dnipro for baptism. Mass conversion did not instantly erase older beliefs. For generations, Christian practices existed beside traditional customs. Seasonal rituals, respect for natural places, and older stories continued beneath a new religious language. Christianity connected Rus more deeply with Byzantium. Churches were built. Priests and books arrived. Religious art, architecture, law, and education changed. The written language used by the church was based on Old Church Slavonic, developed earlier by the followers of Saints Cyril and Methodius. The script used in Rus developed within the Cyrillic tradition. Christianization also strengthened the ruler. The prince could present his authority as part of a sacred order. Marriage ties with Christian dynasties became easier. Rus was no longer viewed by neighboring Christian courts simply as a pagan power. Vladimir's son, Yaroslav the Wise, ruled Kyiv during the 11th century. His reign is often remembered as a high point of Kyivan Rus. Yaroslav did not gain power peacefully. Like many medieval rulers, he fought against relatives for control. Once established, however, he supported building, law, diplomacy, and the church. St. Sophia Cathedral was built in Kyiv during his reign. Its design reflected Byzantine influence, but it also developed local features. Inside were mosaics and frescoes. One famous mosaic showed the Virgin Mary standing with raised hands. The image became known as the Orans of Kyiv. For centuries, it remained one of the city's most recognized sacred images. Yaroslav also supported the growth of written culture. Chronicles were compiled. Religious works were copied. Schools were associated with churches and monasteries. Literacy remained limited, but it was not confined entirely to monks. Archaeologists in other Rus cities have found messages scratched onto birch bark. Graffiti inside churches also shows that visitors could write names, prayers, and brief comments. A collection of laws known as Ruska Pravda developed during this period and afterward. Its rules dealt with injury, theft, property, debt, and social rank. Many punishments involved fines rather than execution. The amount of compensation depended partly on the status of the person harmed. This reflected a deeply unequal society. At the top stood the prince and his family. Below them were boyars and members of the military retinue. There were merchants, craftspeople, free farmers, dependent peasants, and enslaved people. The exact categories changed over time and varied by region. Kyiv itself became a large and wealthy city. Its population is uncertain, but it may have numbered in the tens of thousands. The city contained fortified upper districts, markets, churches, workshops, and neighborhoods near the river. Artisans produced metalwork, glass, pottery, weapons, jewelry, and carved objects. Merchants arrived from many places. A person walking through Kyiv might hear several languages. East Slavic dialects were common. Norse, Greek, Turkic, Hebrew, and other languages may also have been heard in trade and diplomatic circles. Kyivan Rus was part of Europe, but its connections reached in several directions. It maintained close relations with Byzantium. It traded with the Islamic world. It was linked by dynastic marriage to Poland, Hungary, France, Norway, and other kingdoms. Yaroslav's daughters married European rulers. His daughter Anna became Queen of France after marrying King Henry I. This later gave Yaroslav the informal description of father-in-law of Europe. The phrase is modern, but it reflects the broad diplomatic connections of this family. Religious life also expanded. The monastery of the caves, later known as the Kyiv Pechersk Lavra, developed in the 11th century. Its earliest monks lived in caves dug into hills above the Dnipro. Some sought isolation and strict spiritual discipline. Over time, the monastery became an important center of learning, writing, and art. Monks compiled saints' lives and historical accounts. They preserved ideas about the origins and meaning of Rus, yet the strength of Kyivan Rus contained a problem. The ruling dynasty treated territories as the shared inheritance of the princely family. Princes moved between cities according to seniority, family agreement, and military power. A prince might rule one city, then move to another when a senior relative died. This system could work while family relationships remained manageable, but as generations multiplied, the number of princes increased. So did rivalry. After Yaroslav's death in 1054, his sons attempted to govern together. Their cooperation gradually broke down. Wars among princes became frequent. Kyiv remained symbolically important, but other centers gained strength. Chernihiv, Pereyaslav, Volodymyr in Volhynia, Halich, Polotsk, Smolensk, Novgorod, Sizdal, and other cities developed their own political interests. This fragmentation did not mean that Rus culture disappeared. The princes belonged to the same broad dynasty. They shared religious traditions, literary culture, and memories of common origin. But political unity weakened. At the same time, the steppe remained active. The Pechenegs were gradually replaced by the Cumans, known in Rus sources as the Polovtsians. Relations with the Cumans were not simply hostile. Rus princes fought them, traded with them, married into their ruling families, and sometimes invited them as allies in wars against other Rus princes. The frontier between settled land and steppe was a zone of conflict and exchange. One of the most famous works of medieval East Slavic literature emerged from this world. It is known as the Tale of Ihor's Campaign. The poem describes an unsuccessful campaign by Prince Ihor Sviatoslavic against the Cumans in the late 12th century. Its language is rich with images of rivers, animals, wind, darkness, and grief. The poem mourns division among Rus princes. It presents their rivalry as a source of weakness. The work survived in a manuscript discovered many centuries later, though the original manuscript was destroyed in the Moscow Fire of 1812. Scholars have debated its history, but most now regard it as a genuine medieval composition. In 1169, Prince Andrei Bogolubsky of Vladimir Suzdalai organized an army that captured and sacked Kyiv. This was a significant event. Kyiv had been attacked before, but the sack showed that a Rus prince could treat the old capital as the possession of a rival rather than as a city to be respectfully inherited. Even so, Kyiv remained important. It did not suddenly become empty or irrelevant. Its religious institutions, trade, and symbolic prestige continued. In the western lands, the principalities of Halich and Volhynia grew stronger. Halych lay near trade routes leading toward Central Europe and the Carpathians. Its elites gained wealth from resources including salt. Volhynia had fertile land and connections with Poland and other Western neighbors. In the late 12th century, Prince Roman Mstislavic united Halych and Volhynia. His state is often called Galicia, Volhynia. Roman died in battle in 1205, leaving young sons and a period of instability. Eventually, his son Danilo restored control. Danilo of Halych became one of the most important rulers in the region during the 13th century, but his reign unfolded under a new and overwhelming threat. Far to the east, the Mongol Empire had expanded with extraordinary speed. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, Mongol armies conquered vast territories across Asia. Their forces were highly mobile. They used disciplined cavalry, intelligence networks, coordinated movements, and psychological warfare. They could travel rapidly and attack from unexpected directions. In 1223, Rus princes and Cuman allies confronted a Mongol force at the Battle of the Kalka River. The Rus and Cuman armies were divided and poorly coordinated. They suffered a severe defeat. The Mongols then withdrew eastward. For a time, the danger seemed to pass, but it returned. In the late 1230s, a much larger Mongol campaign under Batu Khan moved into the Rus lands. Cities were attacked one after another. Ryazan, Vladimir, Chernihiv, Pereyaslav, and many others were devastated. In 1240, the Mongols reached Kyiv. The city resisted. According to later accounts, the final defenders gathered near the Church of the Tithes. The building collapsed during the fighting, possibly under the weight of people seeking refuge. Kyiv was captured and heavily damaged. The exact scale of destruction and population loss is difficult to measure. Medieval accounts often use dramatic language. Archaeology confirms widespread violence and fire, but the city was not erased forever. People continued to live there. Still, the invasion changed the political world of Rus. The Mongols established authority over most Rus principalities. The western part of their empire became known as the Golden Horde. Rus princes were generally allowed to continue ruling their territories, but they had to recognize Mongol supremacy, pay tribute, and obtain confirmation from the Khan. The Mongols did not directly occupy every village. Their rule worked through tribute, military pressure, diplomacy, and local elites. Some cities recovered more quickly than others. Trade continued. The Golden Horde itself became a wealthy and complex state connecting Eastern Europe with Central Asia and the wider Mongol world. It included Muslims, Christians, followers of traditional steppe religions, and many ethnic groups. Over time, Islam became dominant among its ruling elite. The consequences of Mongol rule differed by region. The northeastern Rus principalities, including Moscow, developed under close relations with the Horde. In the southwest, the Lycia Volhynia tried to balance between Mongol authority and alliances with Western powers. Danilo of Halych accepted a royal crown from a papal representative in 1253 or 1254. He is often called King Danilo. The coronation did not mean that his realm became Roman Catholic. The population and ruling house remained primarily Orthodox. Danilo hoped for Western military support against the Mongols, but large-scale assistance did not arrive. He built towns, strengthened fortifications, encouraged trade, and founded or expanded centers such as Lviv, named after his son Lev. The first known written mention of Lviv dates from the 1250s. Danilo's state preserved a tradition of Rus rulership in the southwest. After his dynasty declined in the 14th century, neighboring powers competed for its lands. Poland took control of Galicia. Lithuania expanded into Volhynia, Kyiv, and much of the former Rus territory. The rise of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania is one of the most important developments in the later medieval history of Ukraine. Lithuanian rulers began with a relatively small Baltic state. During the 13th and 14th centuries, they expanded far to the south and east. They absorbed many lands whose inhabitants were East Slavic and Orthodox. In fact, most of the territory and population of the Grand Duchy eventually came from former Rus principalities. Lithuanian rulers often governed indirectly. Local princes and nobles could retain land and status if they accepted Lithuanian authority. The administrative and written language of the Grand Duchy was a form of Ruthenian, derived from the language of Rus. Orthodox Christianity remained widespread. Legal traditions also drew on earlier Rus practices. A phrase often associated with Lithuanian expansion was that old customs would not be destroyed and new ones would not be introduced. The exact use of this phrase is uncertain, but it captures the general flexibility of early Lithuanian rule. Kyiv came under Lithuanian control in the 14th century. For a time, members of the Lithuanian ruling dynasty governed it as princes. The city slowly recovered from earlier destruction, though it did not regain the political position it had held in the 11th century. Farther south, the Golden Horde began to fragment. Internal struggles weakened central authority. New khanates appeared. One of these was the Crimean Khanate, established in the 15th century. The Crimean Khanate was ruled by the Giray dynasty. Its population included Crimean Tatars, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Goths, Slavs, and others. The Crimean Tatars themselves formed through the mixing of various Turkic and earlier populations of the peninsula and surrounding steppe. Their language and culture developed over centuries. The Khanate was not merely a society of raiders, though raids formed an important part of its economy and military life. Crimea contained farms, towns, markets, mosques, palaces, vineyards, and trading ports. The Khan's palace at Bakhchisarai later became a major cultural center. In the late 15th century, the Crimean Khanate became an ally and dependent partner of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans directly controlled several coastal fortresses and ports, while the Khans ruled much of the interior. From Crimea and the southern steppe, Tatar forces regularly raided north into Polish-Lithuanian and Muscovite territories. They captured people who could be sold into slavery in Black Sea and Mediterranean markets. The number of captives over several centuries was very large, though exact totals are disputed. Villages near the frontier lived with the possibility of sudden attack. Watchmen observed the horizon. People built settlements near forests, rivers, and fortified places. Families could be separated in a few hours. At the same time, the frontier was not a fixed wall. Trade and diplomacy crossed it. Polish-Lithuanian rulers sometimes allied with Crimean Khans. Crimean forces sometimes fought beside Cossacks. Merchants moved through Tatar lands. The history of the steppe was filled with enemies who could become allies, and allies who could become enemies. During the late medieval period, Poland and Lithuania became increasingly connected. Their rulers had shared dynastic ties since the Union of Kruo in 1385. The relationship was strengthened over time. In 1569, the Union of Lublin created the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This was a federal state with an elected monarch and a powerful noble class. As part of the union, many Ukrainian inhabited territories were transferred from the Grand Duchy of Lithuania to the Polish crown. These included Volhynia, Kyiv, and lands farther east. This change had deep consequences. Polish political, legal, and cultural influence increased. Large noble estates expanded. Some local Ruthenian nobles adopted the Polish language and Roman Catholic faith. Others remained Orthodox and defended their traditions. The Commonwealth was unusual for its time. Its nobles enjoyed broad political rights. The parliament, known as the Sejm, participated in government. The king was elected. The state contained many languages and religions. Poles, Ruthenians, Lithuanians, Jews, Germans, Armenians, Tatars, and others lived within its borders. Roman Catholics, Orthodox Christians, Protestants, Jews, Muslims, and Armenian Christians practiced their faiths. There were periods of notable religious tolerance, but political rights were not shared equally. The celebrated liberty of the Commonwealth mainly belonged to the nobility. Most peasants had little political power. Their obligations to landlords increased during the 16th and 17th centuries. As grain exports through Baltic ports became more profitable, nobles expanded large agricultural estates known as folwarks. Peasants were required to provide labor. Serfdom became more restrictive. In many Ukrainian regions, especially where settlement was expanding eastward, the situation varied. Some peasants moved toward the frontier to escape heavy obligations. Others negotiated temporary freedoms when landlords needed settlers, but over time many communities faced growing control by estate owners and officials. Religious change added another layer of tension. The Orthodox Church in the Commonwealth had deep roots, but often lacked the political influence of the Roman Catholic Church. Some Orthodox bishops and nobles sought a new arrangement. In 1596, the Union of Brest created a church that accepted the authority of the Pope while retaining the Eastern Rite, married parish clergy, and much of Orthodox worship. This institution became known as the Uniate Church, and later as the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. The union divided communities. Some bishops accepted it. Many priests, nobles, townspeople, and monasteries rejected it. Supporters believed it could protect Eastern traditions while giving the Church greater equality within the Commonwealth. Opponents saw it as a threat to orthodoxy. The dispute influenced education, publishing, politics, and local conflict. Orthodox brotherhoods appeared in cities such as Lviv and Kyiv. These lay organizations supported schools, printing presses, hospitals, and churches. They defended Orthodox interests and encouraged learning. The development of printing helped spread religious and educational texts. Ivan Fedorov, an early printer in the East Slavic world, worked in Lviv and Ostro during the 16th century. The Ostro Bible, printed in 1581, was one of the most important early complete editions of the Bible in Church Slavonic. Prince Konstantin Vasil Ostrowski supported the Ostro Academy. It became a center of Orthodox scholarship. Later, the Kiev Brotherhood School and the school connected with the Patriarch's Monastery contributed to the institution that became the Kyiv Mohyla Academy. This academy would educate clergy, administrators, writers, and political leaders. Its curriculum drew partly from Western European models. Students studied languages, rhetoric, philosophy, theology, and classical texts. The cultural world of Ruthenian society was becoming more literate and more connected to both Eastern and Western traditions. At the same time, the southern frontier was giving birth to a new military community. These people became known as Cossacks. The word Cossack probably comes from a Turkic word meaning a free person, adventurer, or wanderer. Early Cossacks were not one fixed ethnic or social group. They included runaway peasants, townsmen, lesser nobles, hunters, fishermen, traders, and warriors. Some were Ruthenian, others had Tatar, Moldavian, Polish, or different origins. What united them was life on the frontier. The region south of the settled agricultural zone was often called the Wild Fields. This did not mean that the land was empty. Nomadic groups used it. Traders crossed it. Fortresses guarded parts of it. Seasonal workers came to fish, hunt, gather salt, and keep livestock. But central governments exercised limited control there. The Dnipro flowed through this frontier toward the Black Sea. Below its rapids, Cossacks established fortified centers known as syches. The most famous Cossack community became the Zaporizhian Such. The name referred to its location beyond the rapids of the Dnipro. A Such was both a military camp and a political community. Its exact location changed several times. Cossacks built wooden fortifications, churches, storehouses, and living quarters. They organized themselves into units. Important decisions were made at councils. Leaders, including the chief known as the Kish Otaman, were elected. Cossack society valued the image of freedom and equality among warriors. In practice, differences of wealth and influence existed. Experienced officers could accumulate land, livestock, and political connections. Still, the council tradition distinguished the Sich from the more rigid hierarchy of noble estates. The Cossacks became skilled in steppe warfare. They used horses, firearms, wagons, and small boats called chaikas. These boats could travel down the Dnipro and across parts of the Black Sea. Cossack raiders attacked Ottoman and Crimean ports. They sometimes reached settlements near Constantinople. Such campaigns freed some captives and brought wealth, but they also intensified conflict with the Ottoman Empire and the Crimean Khanate. The Polish-Lithuanian government had an uncertain relationship with the Cossacks. It sometimes needed them for war. Cossacks could defend the frontier and fight the Ottomans, Tatars, or Muscovy. The government created registers of officially recognized Cossacks who received pay and privileges, but the number of registered Cossacks was limited. Many others wanted the same status. When wars ended, the authorities often tried to reduce the register and force unrecognized Cossacks back under the control of landlords. This caused repeated unrest. During the late 16th and early 17th centuries, several Cossack uprisings broke out. Leaders included Krzysztof Kosinski, Severin Nalivico, Taras Fedorovich, and Pavlo Pavluk. These rebellions had different immediate causes. Some involved disputes over land and status. Others involved religious grievances or resistance to government control. Most were eventually defeated. But each uprising showed that the frontier population had become a serious military and political force. One of the best-known Cossack leaders of the early 17th century was Petro Konashevich Sahaydachny. He led campaigns against Ottoman and Crimean targets and supported the Orthodox Church. Under his leadership, the Cossacks joined the Kyiv Orthodox Brotherhood. This gave the Brotherhood military protection and political weight. Sahaydachny also helped restore an Orthodox Church hierarchy in the Commonwealth after many senior positions had passed to supporters of the Union of Brest. In 1621, Cossack forces played an important role in the Battle of Khotin. The Commonwealth army, supported by tens of thousands of Cossacks, resisted a large Ottoman force. The battle ended without a decisive destruction of either side, but the Ottoman advance was halted. Sahaydachny was wounded and died the following year. His career showed the double position of the Cossacks. They could be essential defenders of the Commonwealth. They could also become its most dangerous internal opponents. By the 1630s, tensions were increasing. The Commonwealth's noble system expanded into central and eastern Ukrainian lands. Large estates grew. Peasant obligations became heavier. Orthodox communities feared religious pressure. Many Cossacks resented limits on their recognized status. The frontier remained exposed to Tatar raids, yet the people defending it often felt that the government treated them as temporary soldiers rather than as a permanent political class. In 1638, after another series of rebellions, the Commonwealth imposed new restrictions on the Cossacks. The registered force was reduced and placed under tighter control. For a decade, the region appeared relatively calm. Some Polish writers later called this period the Golden Peace. But the peace was shallow. Beneath it were unresolved grievances concerning land, labor, faith, honor, and political status. The man who would bring these tensions together was Bogdan Khmelnytsky. Khmelnytsky was born around the end of the 16th century. He came from a family connected with the Cossack officer class and received a good education. He served in military campaigns and spent time as an Ottoman captive after the Battle of Sakura. He knew several languages and understood both Cossack and Commonwealth political culture. His rebellion began partly with a personal dispute. A local official named Daniel Heskaski took control of Khmelnytsky's estate at Subotiv and was accused of attacking his family. Khmelnytsky sought justice through legal and political channels. He failed, but personal anger alone cannot explain what followed. Many people were already prepared to rebel. Khmelnytsky traveled to the Zaporizhian Sich and gained support. He also made an alliance with the Crimean Khanate. This alliance was crucial. Earlier Cossack uprisings had often failed because government cavalry could defeat them, or because rebels were isolated. Crimean Tatar horsemen gave Khmelnytsky mobility and strength in open battle. In 1648, the uprising began. Commonwealth forces were defeated at Zhovty Vody and Korsun. Another victory followed at Piliopsi. The speed of these successes transformed a Cossack revolt into a vast social and political upheaval. Peasants attacked landlords and estate officials. Townspeople joined the rebellion. Orthodox clergy often welcomed Cossack victories. Commonwealth authority collapsed across large areas. The violence was severe. Polish nobles and officials were killed or forced to flee. Roman Catholic clergy were attacked. Jewish communities suffered devastating massacres. Many Jews in the Commonwealth worked as leaseholders, tax collectors, estate managers, merchants, and craftspeople. Because some served as intermediaries in the noble economic system, rebels sometimes identified entire Jewish communities with oppression. This led to killings on a very large scale. The exact number of victims is debated, and older estimates are often considered too high. But there is no doubt that the uprising was a catastrophe for Jewish life in the region. Jewish chronicles remembered 1648 and 1649 as years of profound suffering. The events are therefore remembered differently by different communities. In Ukrainian national history, Khmelnytsky has often appeared as a leader of liberation and state building. In Polish memory, the uprising marked destruction and the weakening of the Commonwealth. In Jewish memory, it became associated with massacre and displacement. All these memories belong to the same historical event. The past can hold several truths at once. After his early victories, Khmelnytsky entered Kyiv in late 1648. He was welcomed by crowds and Orthodox leaders. His goals were changing. At first he may have sought restoration of Cossack rights and punishment of enemies. Now he began to speak more broadly about defending the Rus people and the Orthodox faith. A new political order was taking shape. It became known as the Cossack Hetmanate. The Hetmanate was organized into military and administrative regiments. Each regiment controlled a territory and was divided into smaller units. The hetman stood at the top. Colonels and other officers governed locally. The system grew from Cossack military organization, but it now had to administer towns, villages, taxation, diplomacy, and courts. The Hetmanate was not a modern democracy. Cossack councils existed, but powerful officers gained increasing influence. Peasants and townspeople did not have equal political rights. Still, it was a major attempt to create a durable political structure in the central Ukrainian lands. Khmelnytsky needed international support. The Commonwealth remained powerful. The Crimean alliance was useful but unstable. The Khan had his own interests. Crimea did not necessarily want either the Cossacks or the Commonwealth to become too strong. Tatar forces sometimes withdrew at critical moments. They also continued to take captives, including from territories allied with the Cossacks. Khmelnytsky negotiated with the Ottoman Empire, Transylvania, Moldavia, and Muscovy. He searched for a protector or alliance that could preserve the new order. War continued with changing fortunes. The Battle of Zaborov in 1649 led to an agreement granting the Cossacks broad autonomy in several regions. But neither side was satisfied. Fighting resumed. In 1651, the Cossacks and their Crimean allies suffered defeat at Berestechko. The battle involved one of the largest armies seen in 17th century Europe. The Crimean Khan withdrew during the fighting and took Khmelnytsky with him, possibly as a form of detention. Cossack forces were left in a difficult position. They eventually retreated through marshy ground, suffering heavy losses. A new treaty reduced Cossack autonomy. But the war did not end. Khmelnytsky continued to seek a stronger alliance. His attention turned increasingly toward the Tsardom of Muscovy. Muscovy shared the Orthodox faith and claimed connections to the heritage of Rus. But its rulers had been cautious. War with the Commonwealth would be expensive. Moscow also viewed the independent Cossacks with uncertainty. In 1653, the Muscovite government finally decided to accept the Cossacks under the Tsar's protection and enter the war. In January 1654, a council was held at Pereyaslav. Khmelnytsky and many Cossack officers swore loyalty to Tsar Alexei. The exact meaning of the agreement became one of the most disputed questions in Ukrainian, Russian, and Polish history. The Cossack leadership may have understood it as a military alliance or a form of protected autonomy. The Tsar's government saw it as submission to monarchical authority. The original documents are incomplete. Different groups took different oaths, and some refused. The senior Orthodox clergy in Kyiv were cautious. The Zaporizhian Sich did not participate in the same way as the regimental leadership. Later Russian imperial history presented Pereyaslav as the reunification of two branches of one Russian people. Later Ukrainian national history often presented it as a temporary alliance that Moscow violated. The reality was less simple than either formula. The agreement created a relationship whose meaning was not fully settled at the moment it began. Muscovite officials and Cossack leaders continued to negotiate practical terms. The Hetmanate retained its own administration, army, courts, and taxation, but the Tsar gained influence and placed representatives in certain cities. War between Muscovy and the Commonwealth followed. At first, Muscovite and Cossack armies made major advances, but alliances shifted. In 1656, Muscovy agreed to a temporary truce with the Commonwealth without fully consulting Khmelnytsky. He saw this as a betrayal. He again explored alliances with Sweden and Transylvania. Khmelnytsky died in 1657. He left behind a political system that existed but whose international position remained uncertain. His death opened a long period of conflict, known in Ukrainian history as the Ruin. The name describes both physical destruction and political fragmentation. Cossack officers competed for the office of hetman. Foreign powers intervened. The Commonwealth, Muscovy, the Crimean Khanate, and the Ottoman Empire each supported different factions at different moments. The Dnipro gradually became a political dividing line. The territory to the east became known as Left Bank Ukraine. The territory to the west became known as Right Bank Ukraine. These names are based on looking downstream toward the Black Sea. The left bank lies to the east of the river. The right bank lies to the west. Ivan Vyhovsky, who succeeded Khmelnytsky, attempted to reduce Muscovite influence. In 1658, he negotiated the Treaty of Hadiak with the Commonwealth. The plan proposed creating a Grand Duchy of Rus as a third member of the Commonwealth, beside Poland and Lithuania. It promised broad autonomy and recognized the Orthodoxy League. But the agreement was altered during ratification, and many Cossacks distrusted a return to Commonwealth rule. Civil war followed. Vyhovsky's forces, supported by Crimean Tatars, defeated a large Muscovite army at the Battle of Konotop in 1659. Yet the victory did not secure his political position. He soon lost power. Other hetmans followed. Some leaned toward Moscow. Some leaned toward Moscow. Some leaned toward Poland. Some sought Ottoman protection. Each choice created opposition. Towns changed hands. Armies marched across the same fields. Harvests were destroyed. People fled from the right bank toward the left bank, Sloboda, Ukraine, Moldavia, or other safer areas. The right bank was especially devastated. In 1667, Muscovy and the Commonwealth signed the Truce of Andrusovo. They divided much of the Cossack territory between them. The left bank, including Chernihiv and Poltava, came under Muscovite authority. The right bank remained under the Commonwealth. Kyiv was initially supposed to pass back to Poland after a short period, but it remained under Muscovite control. The agreement was made without Cossack participation. For many Cossacks, this confirmed that the neighboring states treated Ukraine as territory to be divided. Petro Doroshenko, a hetman on the right bank, tried to reunite the Cossack lands. He accepted Ottoman protection. This brought Ottoman and Crimean forces deeper into the region. The Commonwealth fought to recover control. Muscovy defended its position on the left bank. The result was further warfare. The Ottoman Empire briefly established authority in parts of Podolia, including the fortress city of Kamianets. But Ottoman influence did not create lasting unity. By the late 17th century, the division of the Ukrainian lands had become more stable. The left bank Hetmanate survived under the authority of the Tsar. It retained important institutions. It had its own regiments, courts, finances, and social elite. The hetman was elected by Cossack officers, though Moscow increasingly influenced the choice. The Zaporizhian Sich remained a distinct military community in the south. Sloboda Ukraine, around cities such as Kharkiv, developed through settlement by Cossacks and peasants who received privileges in exchange for frontier service. On the right bank, the Commonwealth attempted to rebuild authority. Some Cossack units were restored temporarily when they were useful for defense. but large areas had lost much of their population. New settlers arrived slowly. The frontier moved and changed once again. In the left bank Hetmanate, Cossack society became more hierarchical. Senior officers, known collectively as the Starshina, accumulated estates and wealth. They sought recognition as a noble class. Ordinary Cossacks tried to preserve military privileges. Peasants faced growing obligations. The ideals of Cossack freedom remained powerful, but daily life moved toward greater inequality. One of the most famous hetmans of this period was Kyivan Rus. He became hetman in 1687. Mazeppa was highly educated and experienced in diplomacy. He supported churches, monasteries, schools, and printing. Many Baroque buildings were constructed or rebuilt during his rule. This architectural style is sometimes called Ukrainian Baroque or Cossack Baroque. It combined Orthodox forms with decorative elements common in Central and Western Europe. White walls, curved gables, layered domes, and richly designed interiors changed the appearance of Kyiv, Chernihiv, and other towns. Mazeppa initially served the Russian Tsar loyally. The Tsardom was becoming a more centralized empire under Peter I, later known as Peter the Great. Peter fought a long war against Sweden for access to the Baltic Sea. The conflict became known as the Great Northern War. Cossack troops were required to join Russian campaigns. They worked on fortifications and traveled far from home. Losses were heavy. The Hetmanate's economy carried a growing burden. Mazeppa feared that Peter's reforms and military demands would eventually destroy Cossack autonomy. He also faced rumors that Russian commanders intended to reorganize or replace the Hetmanate's institutions. In 1708, during the Swedish invasion of the Russian state, Mazeppa changed sides. He joined King Charles XII of Sweden. Mazeppa hoped Swedish victory would protect or expand the autonomy of Ukraine. Only part of the Cossack elite followed him. Many officers hesitated. Some distrusted Sweden. Some feared Russian retaliation. Some learned of the decision too late. Peter responded quickly. Russian troops captured Mazeppa's capital at Batorin. The city was destroyed, and many inhabitants were killed. The number of victims remains debated, but the attack was intended to terrify others who might support Mazeppa. The Zaporizhian Sich later joined the Swedish alliance. It too faced destruction by Russian forces. In 1709, the Swedish and Allied armies confronted Peter's forces at the Battle of Poltava. The Swedish army was weakened by a difficult campaign, shortages, illness, and the wounding of Charles XII. The Russian army wanted decisive victory. Swedish power in Eastern Europe declined. Mazeppa and Charles fled south into Ottoman territory. Mazeppa died later that year near the city of Bender. His image became sharply divided. In Russian imperial tradition, he was condemned as a traitor. The Russian Orthodox Church declared an anathema against him. In Ukrainian national tradition, especially from the 19th century onward, he became a symbol of resistance to imperial control. European writers and artists also transformed him into a romantic figure, often using legends that had little connection with his real life. The historical Mazeppa was neither a simple villain nor a modern nationalist in the later sense. He was a statesman of the Cossack elite, trying to preserve power and autonomy in a dangerous political environment. After Poltava, the Russian government tightened its control. A new hetman, Ivan Skoropadsky, was elected under close supervision. Russian officials became more involved in administration. Cossack troops continued to serve in imperial wars and construction projects. Thousands were sent to work on canals and fortifications in harsh conditions. Many never returned. Some Cossacks who followed Mazeppa into exile elected Pilip Orlik as hetman in 1710. Orlik produced a political document often called the Constitution of Pilip Orlik. It described limits on the hetman's authority and a role for a general council. It also spoke of the rights of the Zaporizhian host and the separation of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine from Moscow's control. The document is sometimes described as one of Europe's earliest constitutions. It was an important statement of political principles. but it was written in exile and was never fully implemented in Ukraine. Orlik spent much of his life seeking support from Sweden, the Ottoman Empire, and other powers. His efforts failed to restore the exiled Cossack government. Within the Russian Empire, the Hetmanate continued, but its autonomy was gradually reduced. Peter I created a body called the Little Russian Collegium to supervise the hetman's government. The imperial term Little Russia came from older Byzantine and church geography. Over time, Russian authorities used it to describe the Ukrainian lands and to place them within an imperial idea of a broader Russian people. The term did not initially carry exactly the same meaning it acquired later, but it increasingly supported the claim that Ukrainians were a regional branch rather than a separate historical community. After Peter's death, imperial policy sometimes became less strict. The office of hetman was restored for periods. Danilo Apostle served as hetman in the 1720s and early 1730s. He negotiated limited rights for the hetmanate and attempted administrative reforms. After his death, the empire again delayed the election of a successor. The final hetman was Kyrylo Rozumovsky. He was elected in 1750 under Empress Elizabeth. Rozumovsky came from a Cossack family. His older brother, Alexei, had become a favorite and probably the secret husband of the Empress. Kyrylo received a European education and became president of the Russian Academy of Sciences while still very young. As hetman, he attempted to strengthen administration and make the office hereditary within his family. This worried the imperial government. When Catherine II came to power, she pursued greater centralization. In 1764, she forced Rozumovsky to resign. The office of hetman was abolished. A new Little Russian Collegium took control. Catherine's officials studied the region's population, economy, and institutions. They aimed to bring the territory into the same administrative system as the rest of the empire. The Cossack regiments were gradually transformed into regular imperial military units. The traditional territorial structure disappeared. Members of the Cossack elite were incorporated into the Russian nobility if they could prove their status. Many accepted imperial service. They became officers, administrators, landowners, and court officials. Their local identity did not vanish, but it existed within the empire. The Zaporizhian Sich survived a little longer. Its Cossacks remained useful in wars against the Ottoman Empire and the Crimean Khanate. But Russian expansion southward reduced the need for an autonomous frontier army. The imperial government also viewed the Sich as socially dangerous. Runaway peasants could seek refuge there. Its council traditions and independent diplomacy conflicted with central control. In 1775, after a successful war against the Ottoman Empire, Russian troops surrounded the Sich. The Cossacks were unable to organize effective resistance. The fortress was dismantled. The Zaporizhian Sich ceased to exist as an autonomous institution. Some Cossacks entered Russian service. Others moved into Ottoman territory and established a new community near the Danube. Later, groups of former Zaporizhians were resettled in the Kuban region, where they became part of the Black Sea Cossack host. They carried songs, customs, and forms of speech from Ukraine into the northern Caucasus. The destruction of the Sich became another powerful historical symbol. For the empire, it represented the removal of an outdated military frontier. For later Ukrainian writers, it represented the loss of freedom. During the same period, the Russian Empire expanded toward the Black Sea. A series of wars weakened the Ottoman Empire and the Crimean Khanate. In 1774, the Treaty of Kossuth-Kainarka declared the Crimean Khanate formally independent of Ottoman control, though Russian influence became dominant. In 1783, Catherine II annexed Crimea. The annexation ended the rule of the Giray dynasty. Russian officials began reorganizing the peninsula. New military bases and towns were developed. Sevastopol became the main base of the Black Sea Fleet. The annexation brought major changes to Crimean Tatar society. Land ownership shifted. Russian nobles and settlers received property. Some Crimean Tatars left for the Ottoman Empire. Immigration continued in waves during the 19th century. Yet Crimean Tatar culture remained deeply rooted in the peninsula. The imperial government called the newly conquered southern territories New Russia. The name included a broad region along the Black Sea and the lower Dnipro. It did not mean that the land had been empty before Russian rule. Ukrainian peasants, Cossacks, Crimean Tatars, Nogais, Moldavians, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and others already lived there or used the steppe. But imperial authorities encouraged new settlement. Russians, Ukrainians, Germans, Bulgarians, Serbs, Greeks, and other groups moved into the region. New towns expanded. Odessa was founded as an imperial port in the 1790s on the site of an earlier Ottoman settlement. It grew rapidly during the 19th century. Grain from the steppe traveled through Odessa to Mediterranean and Western European markets. The city became multilingual and cosmopolitan. Ukrainian, Russian, Yiddish, Greek, Italian, French, Armenian, and other languages could be heard in its streets. Farther west, another empire was also gaining Ukrainian lands. During the late 18th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was divided among Russia, Prussia, and Austria. The three partitions occurred in 1772, 1793, and 1793, and 1795. The Commonwealth disappeared from the map. Most right-bank Ukrainian lands passed to the Russian Empire. Galicia passed to the Habsburg monarchy. Bukovina also came under Habsburg rule after being taken from the Ottoman-controlled Principality of Moldavia. Transcarpathia had long been connected to the Kingdom of Hungary, which was part of the Habsburg lands. By the end of the 18th century, nearly all Ukrainian inhabited territories were divided between two empires. The larger part belonged to the Russian Empire. The western regions belonged to the Habsburg monarchy. This division would shape Ukrainian history throughout the 19th century. The empires had different laws, institutions, and political cultures. They also changed over time. A person living near Poltava, a person living near Lviv, and a person living in a Carpathian village might speak related dialects and share some religious traditions. But they lived under different rulers. They attended different schools. They served in different armies. They used different official languages. Their paths toward a modern Ukrainian identity would not be identical. Before moving into that 19th century world, it helps to pause. For many centuries, the lands of Ukraine had belonged to no single continuous state. They had been home to farming villages, steppe confederations, Greek colonies, Rus principalities, the Golden Horde, Lithuania, Poland, the Crimean Khanate, the Cossack Hetmanate, and several empires. Each period left something behind. Some traces remained in language. Some remained in religious traditions. Some remained in city plans, songs, laws, family names, and memories. Many disappeared almost entirely. History did not move in a straight line toward 1991. People in earlier centuries could not see the destination. They acted within their own smaller worlds. They tried to protect a village, preserve an estate, defend a church, escape a landlord, serve a ruler, or survive another winter. Only later would these separate experiences be gathered into a national story. At the beginning of the 19th century, most people in the Ukrainian lands were peasants. They lived in villages and worked the land. Their daily lives followed the seasons. Spring brought plowing and planting. Summer brought long days of work. Autumn brought harvest. Winter brought repair, weaving, religious festivals, storytelling, and preparation for another year. The majority could not read. Most had little direct contact with central government. They understood identity through family, village, region, social status, and faith. A person might call themselves Orthodox, Greek, Catholic, a Cossack descendant, a local inhabitant of Poltava, a Ruthenian, a Little Russian, or simply a peasant of a particular village. The word Ukrainian existed, but it had not yet become the universal national identity it would later become. In the Russian Empire, serfdom remained central to rural life. Serfs were legally tied to estates and landlords. They could be required to work on a noble's land, pay dues, and obtain proficiency for major decisions. Conditions varied. Some landlords were rarely present and worked through estate managers. Others closely controlled village life. Serfs were not identical to enslaved people, but their freedom was severely restricted. They could be sold with land and sometimes without it. Despite legal limitations, families feared separation. Punishment could be harsh. On the former lands of the Hetmanate, descendants of Cossacks tried to defend their traditional status. Some became state peasants rather than private serfs. Others lost privileges over time. The old Cossack order was fading, but memories of it remained strong. Families preserved documents claiming noble or Cossack ancestry. Songs remembered wars, hetmans, captivity, and the steppe. Blind traveling musicians known as kobzars performed epic songs called dumi. They often accompanied themselves on instruments such as the kobza or bandura. Their songs told of Cossack campaigns, prisoners escaping Ottoman captivity, family separation, and moral duty. The stories changed as they were performed. They were not exact historical records, but they carried emotional memory from one generation to another. This world inspired one of the central figures of Ukrainian culture. Taras Shevchenko was born in 1814 in the village of Morinci, in the Kyiv region. He was born a serf. His parents belonged legally to the estate of a wealthy landlord. Shevchenko showed talent for drawing. As a young man, he traveled with his owner to Vilnius and St. Petersburg. There, artists and writers noticed his ability. A group of supporters raised money to purchase his freedom in 1838. Shevchenko trained as an artist at the Imperial Academy of Arts. He painted portraits, landscapes, and scenes from daily life. But his greatest historical influence came through poetry. In 1840, he published a small collection titled Kobzar. He wrote in the Ukrainian vernacular. At the time, much educated writing in the Russian Empire used Russian, Polish, or other established literary languages. Ukrainian was often treated by elites as a rural dialect suitable for songs or comedy. Shevchenko used it for grief, anger, history, beauty, and political thought. His poems describe village suffering, lost Cossack freedom, social injustice, and the loneliness of people without power. He criticized landlords and imperial rule. He also challenged romantic images of the past. The Cossack era in his poetry could be heroic, but it could also be violent and tragic. Shevchenko helped transform Ukrainian from a language associated mainly with oral culture into a modern literary language. He did not do this alone. Earlier writers had already used forms of Ukrainian. Ivan Kotlyarsky's Aeneida, first published at the end of the 18th century, retold Virgil's ancient epic as a comic Cossack story. The Trojans became wandering Zaporizhian Cossacks. The poem was humorous, earthy, and full of details about food, clothing, and custom. It showed that the spoken language could carry a long literary work. Other writers collected folklore, wrote plays, and studied local history. But Shevchenko gave the language a new moral authority. His life also made him a symbol. In the 1840s, he joined a small secret group known as the Brotherhood of Saints Cyril and Methodius. Its members discussed Slavic cooperation, social reform, education, and the end of serfdom. Some imagined a federation of free Slavic peoples. The authorities arrested the group in 1847. Shevchenko received the harshest punishment because of his poetry. He was sent to military service in distant imperial forts and forbidden to write or draw. He continued secretly. After about 10 years, he was released. His health had suffered. He died in 1861, only 47 years old. His body was later buried on a hill near Konev, above the Dnipro. The site became a place of pilgrimage. For later generations, Shevchenko was not merely a poet. He became a voice for dignity, language, and national survival. Yet Ukrainian cultural revival was not limited to literature. During the late 18th and early 19th centuries, scholars became interested in folklore and the history of the Cossack lands. This was part of a wider European movement known as Romanticism. Across Europe, intellectuals collected folk songs, studied local languages, and searched for the spirit of nations in rural traditions. In Ukraine, these activities had political potential. A folk song could be presented as evidence that a people possessed its own historical personality. A grammar could show that a language had rules and structure. A history of the Cossacks could challenge the idea that the region had always been merely a province. At first, many participants in the cultural revival did not seek political independence. Some remained loyal servants of the Russian Empire. They could see themselves as both Little Russian and part of a larger imperial society. Identity was layered. Over the course of the century, however, imperial restrictions made cultural questions increasingly political. The Russian government feared separatism, especially after repeated Polish uprisings. Polish nobles remained influential in right-bank Ukraine. Many estates were still owned by Polish families, while most peasants spoke Ukrainian dialects and followed Orthodox or Greek Catholic traditions. The Polish uprising of 1830 to 1831 was suppressed by Russia. Another major uprising began in 1863. Russian authorities became suspicious of all regional movements that might weaken imperial unity. In 1863, Interior Minister Pyotr Valuev issued a circular restricting the publication of religious and educational texts in Ukrainian. The circular claimed that no separate Little Russian language had existed, did exist, or could exist. Fiction was still allowed to a limited degree. The statement revealed a contradiction. The government insisted that Ukrainian was not a real language, while treating its use as politically dangerous. In 1876, Tsar Alexander II signed the Ukaz. This decree imposed broader restrictions. It prohibited most Ukrainian language publications within the empire and banned the import of Ukrainian books printed abroad. Public performances and song lyrics in Ukrainian were also restricted. The rules changed in practice and were not always enforced equally, but they damaged education, publishing, and cultural organization. Writers found ways around them. Some published in Habsburg Galicia. Some used Russian for scholarship while supporting Ukrainian culture privately. Some continued through theater, music, and informal networks. The Habsburg lands offered a different environment. In Galicia, the population was socially divided. Polish nobles and urban elites held considerable power. The eastern part of Galicia had a large Ruthenian-speaking peasant population, most of whom belonged to the Greek Catholic Church. The Church used the Eastern Christian Rite but recognized papal authority. Its parish priests often married and lived within village communities. Because educated secular Ruthenians were relatively few, the clergy played a major role in cultural development. The Habsburg government introduced reforms under Maria Theresa and Joseph II. These reforms improved clerical education and reduced some forms of noble control. Greek Catholic seminaries trained a new educated class. In the early 19th century, small groups began collecting songs and promoting the local language. One important group was known as the Ruthenian Triad. Its members included Markian Sheshevich, Ivan Vahilevich, and Yakiv Holovatsky. They published a literary collection called The Nymph of the Dnipro in 1837. It used the vernacular language and celebrated folk culture. The book was printed outside Galicia because local censorship was strict. The Revolutionary Year of 1848 changed the political atmosphere. Revolution spread across Europe. In the Austrian Empire, serfdom was abolished. Peasants gained personal freedom, though economic hardship remained. In Lviv, Ruthenian activists created the Supreme Ruthenian Council. They declared that the Ruthenians of Galicia belonged to a larger nation numbering millions and connected with people across the border in the Russian Empire. They began publishing a newspaper and demanded cultural rights. At the same time, Polish activists claimed Galicia as part of a future restored Poland. The two movements competed. The Habsburg government sometimes encouraged Ruthenian organization as a counterweight to Polish nationalism. This gave Ruthenian leaders opportunities, but it also placed them in a complicated relationship with imperial authority. the question of identity remained unsettled. Some Galician Ruthenians believed that their language and culture were part of a wider Russian civilization. They became known as Russophiles. Others increasingly adopted the name Ukrainian and looked toward the literary movement developing in central Ukraine. These Ukrainophiles argued that the spoken language of the people should form the basis of education and literature. By the late 19th century, the Ukrainian orientation was gaining strength. Lviv became a major center of Ukrainian publishing because the Russian Empire restricted such activity. Books and journals printed in Galicia could sometimes be carried secretly across the border. Writers and scholars from the Russian Empire cooperated with Galician activists. A shared cultural space gradually formed despite political division. The 19th century also brought major economic change. In the Russian Empire, serfdom was abolished in 1861. The reform gave peasants legal freedom. But freedom did not immediately bring prosperity. Peasants often received less land than they believed they needed. They had to make long-term payments for their allotments. Landlords retained valuable forests, pastures, and fields. Population growth increased pressure on village resources. Many families divided small plots among sons, creating holdings too small to support everyone. Some peasants worked seasonally on estates or traveled to towns. Others moved toward the southern and eastern regions or farther into the empire. Industrialization changed eastern and southern Ukraine. The Donbass contained rich coal deposits. The Kryvyi region contained iron ore. Railways connected mines, factories, ports, and grain-producing areas. During the late 19th century, the Donbass became one of the most important industrial regions of the Russian Empire. Foreign investment played a major role. British, Belgian, French, German, and other entrepreneurs brought capital and technology. The city, now called Donetsk, developed around a metalworking plant founded by the Welsh industrialist John Hughes. The settlement became known as Uzivka, derived from his surname as pronounced locally. Workers arrived from Ukrainian and Russian villages and from other parts of the empire. Industrial cities became linguistically and socially mixed. Many workers lived in crowded housing. Shifts were long, mine accidents were common, air filled with coal dust and smoke. The rhythm of factory whistles replaced the rhythm of village seasons. Odessa continued to grow as a port. Kharkiv became an industrial, educational, and administrative center. Katerinoslav, later called Dnipro, expanded through metallurgy and rail transport. Kyiv developed food processing, machinery, trade, and finance. The sugar industry became especially important in central and right-bank Ukraine. Wealthy business families funded schools, hospitals, museums, religious buildings, and cultural projects. Industrial growth also created a modern working class. Workers organized strikes and discussed socialist ideas. Illegal political literature circulated in factories and railway workshops. Marxist groups appeared. So did populist movements that focused on the peasantry. The empire's police monitored activists, arrested organizers, and sent many into exile. The Jewish population of Ukrainian towns and cities also experienced rapid change. After the partitions of the Commonwealth, the Russian Empire gained a very large Jewish population. The government restricted most Jews to a region known as the Pale of Settlement. Much of present-day Ukraine lay within it. Jewish communities lived in large cities, small towns, and market settlements known as shtetls. They included merchants, artisans, teachers, religious scholars, laborers, and professionals. Yiddish was widely spoken. Hebrew remained important in religion and scholarship. Some Jews adopted Russian or Polish in education and public life. The 19th century brought both new opportunities and severe discrimination. Government rules limited residence, education, and certain occupations. Economic change disrupted traditional livelihoods. Anti-Semitic rumors and political tension sometimes led to violence. After the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881, pogroms broke out in many towns of the southwest. Jewish homes and shops were attacked. People were beaten and killed. Authorities often responded slowly or inadequately. Further pogroms occurred in the early 20th century. These experiences encouraged different political responses. Some Jews emigrated, especially to the United States and Western Europe. Some joined socialist organizations. The Jewish Labor Bund promoted workers' rights and Yiddish culture. Others supported Zionism and the creation of a Jewish homeland. Still others sought integration and reform within the empire. Ukrainian and Jewish lives often existed side by side. People traded in the same markets, lived on nearby streets, and shared parts of local culture. But social boundaries, economic competition, religious difference, and political manipulation could create mistrust. The relationship cannot be reduced to either permanent harmony or permanent conflict. It contained both cooperation and tragedy. In the later 19th century, Ukrainian political organization became more visible. In the Russian Empire, informal cultural groups called hromadas appeared. Their members studied language, published materials, supported Sunday schools, and researched history and folklore. Mikhailo Drahomanov became one of the most influential thinkers connected with this movement. He was a scholar, political writer, and advocate of civil rights. Drahomanov criticized both imperial oppression and narrow nationalism. He supported federalism, local self-government, social reform, and cooperation among peoples. Because of government pressure, he spent years in exile in Geneva and later taught in Sofia. His writings influenced activists in both the Russian and Habsburg empires. Another major figure was historian Mikhailo Hrushevsky. Born in 1866, Hrushevsky studied in Kyiv and later became a professor in Lviv. He wrote a monumental, multi-volume History of Kyivan Rus. His interpretation challenged the traditional imperial account that treated the history of Kyiv simply as the beginning of Russian history centered later in Moscow. Hrushevsky argued that the history of Kyivan Rus belonged primarily to the historical development of Ukraine and that the Ukrainian people had a distinct continuous past. Modern historians may disagree with parts of his national framework, but his work was foundational. It gave Ukrainian political and cultural movements a detailed historical narrative. In Galicia, political parties could operate more openly than in the Russian Empire. The Austrian constitutional system was limited, but it allowed elections, newspapers, associations, and parliamentary activity. Ukrainian activists created reading rooms through an organization called Prospita. These reading rooms brought books, newspapers, lectures, and practical education to villages. Cooperatives helped peasants obtain credit, sell products, and avoid dependence on private lenders. Cultural work became connected with daily economics. If a village had a reading room, a cooperative shop, a choir, and an elected local activist, national identity became part of ordinary life. Ivan Franko was one of the leading writers and thinkers of Galicia. He wrote poetry, fiction, criticism, scholarship, and political journalism. His work described workers, peasants, intellectuals, poverty, love, and social conflict. He was influenced by socialism but did not remain within a single ideological position. Lesia Ukrainta, born Larisa Cossack, became another central literary figure. She wrote poetry, drama, and essays. She lived with serious illness from childhood, but traveled widely and learned many languages. Her works drew on Ukrainian themes, classical history, biblical stories, and European literature. She often explored freedom, dignity, and resistance. Her pen name quietly declared connection with Ukraine at a time when the country did not exist as an independent state. By the beginning of the 20th century, the Ukrainian movement had developed literature, scholarship, political groups, newspapers, and civic organizations, but it still faced enormous obstacles. The Ukrainian lands remained divided. Most of the population was rural and poor. Literacy was improving but still limited. Cities in the Russian Empire were often dominated culturally by Russian, Polish, or Yiddish-speaking populations. Many people who spoke Ukrainian dialects did not yet identify strongly with the political Ukrainian nation. Others held several identities at once. The modern nation was being built through schools, military service, migration, newspapers, elections, and conflict. Then came the revolution of 1905. Russia's defeat in war against Japan weakened the government. Workers went on strike, peasants attacked estates. Sailors and soldiers mutinied. Political demonstrations spread. In Ukraine, strikes affected industrial centers and railways. Peasant unrest shook the countryside. National activists demanded language rights. For a short period, censorship became less strict. Ukrainian newspapers appeared legally in the Russian Empire. Cultural organizations expanded. The first elected imperial parliament, the State Duma, included deputies who raised Ukrainian concerns. The Tsarist government regained control and later restricted many freedoms, but the revolution changed political expectations. People had seen mass strikes, public meetings, and elections. They had learned that the empire could be challenged. Socialist, liberal, nationalist, and monarchist movements all prepared for future struggles. No one knew how soon the old order would collapse. In 1914, the First World War began. The conflict divided the Ukrainian lands between opposing empires. The Russian Empire fought against Austria-Hungary and Germany. Ukrainians served in both the Russian and Austro-Hungarian armies. Men who spoke similar dialects and shared similar customs could meet across the battlefield in different uniforms. Galicia became a major war zone. Russian forces invaded in 1914 and occupied Lviv. Imperial authorities suspected Ukrainian activists of disloyalty. They arrested Greek Catholic clergy and cultural leaders. Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky, head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, was deported into the Russian interior. Russian officials attempted to weaken institutions they considered expressions of Ukrainian separatism. Before the invasion, the Austro-Hungarian authorities had also acted brutally. Fearing Russian sympathizers, they arrested thousands of Galicians, especially those associated with Russophile organizations. Some were sent to internment camps such as Tollerhof. Disease, hunger, and poor conditions caused many deaths. The front moved back and forth. Villages were burned, crops were taken, families fled, refugees traveled east and west. The war turned questions of identity into matters of military security. A language, newspaper, or church connection could cause suspicion. Ukrainian political leaders in Austria-Hungary formed organizations supporting their national goals. A volunteer unit called the Ukrainian Sich Riflemen was created within the Austro-Hungarian army. Its numbers were limited, but it became symbolically important. The riflemen developed songs, publications, and a strong sense of Ukrainian political purpose. Some hoped that an Austro-German victory would weaken Russia and allow an autonomous or independent Ukraine to emerge. Inside the Russian Empire, other Ukrainians believed that Russia might unite all Ukrainian lands after defeating Austria. The future remained uncertain. The war exhausted every empire involved. Millions of soldiers died or were wounded. Food shortages worsened. Transport systems failed. Trust in governments weakened. In March 1917, according to the modern calendar, revolution broke out in Petrograd. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated. The Russian Empire's monarchy ended with surprising speed. A provisional government attempted to continue the war and govern until elections could be held. At the same time, councils of workers and soldiers, known as Soviets, appeared across the former empire. Authority became divided. In Kyiv, Ukrainian activists created the Central Rada. At first, it was a council of cultural, political, and professional organizations. Mikhailo Hrushevsky became its president. He returned from exile and was welcomed as the leading historian of Ukraine. The Central Rada demanded national territorial autonomy within a democratic and federal Russia. It did not initially declare independence. Its leaders hoped that the revolution would allow different peoples of the former empire to govern themselves while remaining within a shared federation. Ukrainian political life expanded quickly. Soldiers formed Ukrainian units and congresses. Peasants demanded land. Teachers called for Ukrainian language education. Newspapers and public meetings spread national ideas. The blue and yellow flag became increasingly visible. The colors had earlier historical and regional associations, especially in Galicia, but now they became symbols of the broader Ukrainian movement. The Central Rada issued a series of declarations known as Universals. The first Universal, in June 1917, proclaimed Ukrainian autonomy without waiting for approval from the Russian Provisional Government. The second Universal represented a compromise. The Provisional Government recognized the Central Rada in a limited form, while the Rada agreed to postpone a final decision on autonomy. Tension remained. The Central Rada faced a difficult task. It had to build institutions while the army was collapsing, the economy was failing, and social expectations were rising. Peasants wanted immediate redistribution of land. Soldiers wanted peace. Workers demanded control and better conditions. National minorities wanted guarantees. Political parties disagreed over the pace of change. Then, in November 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd. Led by Vladimir Lenin, they promised peace, land, and power to the Soviets. The Central Rada rejected the Bolshevik takeover. Its third Universal proclaimed the Ukrainian People's Republic. The new republic was still described as part of a future democratic Russian Federation. It claimed authority over much of the Ukrainian territory of the former empire. It promised civil rights, land reform, and an 8-hour working day. But declarations were easier than control. Bolshevik organizations had support among some workers and soldiers, especially in industrial cities and garrisons. Other socialist parties remained influential. Many peasants cared more about land than about distant governance. The old imperial army was dissolving. Weapons were everywhere. Local power could belong to whichever armed group controlled a railway station or town hall. The Bolshevik government demanded that the Central Rada allow its troops to move through Ukraine and stop disarming pro-Bolshevik units. The Rada refused. War began. Bolshevik forces advanced from the north and east. A Soviet government of Ukraine was declared in Kharkiv. This government claimed to represent workers and peasants against the Central Rada. In Kyiv, the Rada moved toward full independence. Its fourth Universal, issued in January 1918, proclaimed the Ukrainian People's Republic a sovereign state. The declaration came during invasion and crisis. Near the railway station of Kruty, a small Ukrainian force, including students and cadets, attempted to delay a larger Bolshevik advance. The battle later became a symbol of youthful sacrifice. Its military effect was limited but meaningful, delaying the advance for a short time. Bolshevik troops entered Kyiv. Violence followed. People suspected of supporting the Ukrainian movement or the old officer class were executed. The Central Rada fled west. To survive, it negotiated with Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Central Powers were still fighting the First World War and desperately needed food. In February 1918, the Ukrainian People's Republic signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. With them, Germany and Austria-Hungary recognized Ukraine and agreed to provide military assistance. In return, Ukraine promised large deliveries of grain and other supplies. German and Austro-Hungarian forces drove the Bolsheviks out of much of Ukraine. The Central Rada returned to Kyiv, but its authority remained weak. It could not collect the promised grain quickly. Peasants resisted attempts to restore order on estates. The German military wanted a government capable of delivering food. In April 1918, the Central Rada was overthrown. A former imperial general, Pavlo Skoropadsky, took power with German support. He adopted the title of Hetman. His state became known as the Ukrainian state, or the Hetmanate. Skoropadsky's government was conservative. It restored private property and relied on former imperial officials, landowners, and specialists. This angered peasants who feared the return of old landlords. Yet the regime also built important institutions. It established Ukrainian universities, expanded schools, organized state administration, and founded the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. The Academy's first president was the scientist Holodomor. Skoropadsky attempted to create a stable bureaucracy and regular army, but his power depended heavily on German troops. In November 1918, Germany was defeated in the war. The German emperor abdicated. German and Austro-Hungarian soldiers prepared to leave Ukraine. Skoropadsky tried to gain support from Russian conservative forces by announcing a future federation with a restored non-Bolshevik Russia. This alienated Ukrainian nationalists. An uprising began under a body called the Directorate. Its leading figures included Volodymyr Vinichenko and Simon Petliura. Skoropadsky's forces collapsed. He abdicated in December and left the country. The Directorate restored the Ukrainian People's Republic. But the military situation was even worse than before. Ukraine became the center of several overlapping wars. The Bolsheviks advanced again from the north and east. White Russian armies fought to restore a united, non-Bolshevik Russia and rejected Ukrainian independence. Polish forces competed for territory in the west. French and other Allied troops landed in southern ports, but soon withdrew. Peasant armies controlled local regions. Anarchists under Nestor Makhno became powerful in the southeast. Warlords known as Ottomans raised armed groups that sometimes changed allegiance. Government authority shifted constantly. In the western lands, the collapse of Austria-Hungary created another Ukrainian state. In November 1918, Ukrainian soldiers took control of Lviv and proclaimed the West Ukrainian People's Republic that claimed eastern Galicia, northern Bukovina, and Transcarpathian lands where Ukrainians or Ruthenians formed large parts of the population. But Polish leaders also claimed Lviv and eastern Galicia. The city itself had a Polish majority, while the surrounding countryside was mainly Ukrainian. Fighting began almost immediately. Young Polish volunteers defended parts of Lviv. Ukrainian forces surrounded the city but could not hold it permanently. A Polish-Ukrainian war followed. The West Ukrainian government built an army known as the Ukrainian Galician Army that fought with discipline but suffered from shortages of weapons and international support. In January 1919, the Ukrainian People's Republic and the West Ukrainian People's Republic proclaimed unification. The ceremony took place in Kyiv on St. Sophia Square. The act had great symbolic importance. For the first time, political representatives from the former Russian and Habsburg empires publicly declared that their Ukrainian lands belonged to one state. In practice, however, the two governments retained separate armies and administrations. Their military needs often differed. The Western government focused on war with Poland. The Directorate focused on Bolshevik and white forces. The Union existed more strongly as an ideal than as a functioning state. By mid-1919, Polish forces had pushed the Ukrainian Galician army eastward. The Galician troops crossed the Zbruch River and joined forces with the army of the Ukrainian People's Republic. For a brief moment, the combined Ukrainian armies advanced and entered Kyiv, but White Russian forces under General Anton Denikin approached from the south and east. Denikin's movement supported a united and indivisible Russia. It refused to recognize Ukrainian independence. Ukrainian and white troops entered Kyiv almost at the same time. Tension led to withdrawal by the Ukrainians. The strategic opportunity was lost. Disease became as dangerous as battle. Typhus spread through the armies. Soldiers lacked medicine, food, boots, and warm clothing. Units shrank. Civilians suffered from requisitions and changing occupation regimes. Every army demanded grain and horses. Villages sometimes resisted all sides. The years from 1917 to 1921 were also marked by widespread pogroms against Jews. Many different armed formations participated. These included units associated with the Ukrainian People's Republic, white forces, red forces, local warlords, and peasant bands. The largest share of documented pogrom violence is often attributed to forces formally connected with the Directorate and to unaffiliated Ottomans who sometimes claimed loyalty to it. Szymon Petliura issued orders condemning pogroms and attempted to punish some perpetrators, but his government often lacked control over its own armed units. Tens of thousands of Jewish civilians were killed, though exact estimates vary. Many more were injured, assaulted, robbed, or displaced. These pogroms became one of the darkest parts of the revolutionary era. They also shaped later arguments over Petliura's responsibility. Some view him as a leader who opposed the violence but lacked power. Others argue that a head of state bears responsibility for crimes committed by forces acting in his name. The debate continues, but the suffering of the victims is beyond dispute. Among the many armed movements, Nestor Makhno's forces created an unusual political experiment in southern and eastern Ukraine. Makhno came from a poor peasant family in Huliapol. He had been imprisoned under the Tsar for revolutionary activity. After 1917, he organized peasant forces inspired by anarchism. The Makhnovists opposed landlords, foreign occupation, white armies, and centralized government. They supported local councils and collective self-management. Their army was highly mobile. It used horse-drawn carts fitted with machine guns, known as techankas. The Makhnovists sometimes allied with the Bolsheviks against white forces. They contributed to the defeat of General Wrangel's army in Crimea in 1990. Once the common enemy was defeated, the Bolsheviks turned against them. Makhno's movement was crushed. He eventually fled into exile. His supporters remembered him as a defender of peasant freedom. His enemies described him as a bandit. As with many figures of the Civil War, both the idealism and the violence were real. By late 1919, the Ukrainian People's Republic was close to collapse. Petliura sought an alliance with Poland. The Polish leader Józef Pilsudski hoped to build a federation of states between Germany and Russia. He viewed an independent Ukraine as a possible barrier against Russian power. In April 1920, Petliura and Pilsudski reached an agreement. Poland recognized the Ukrainian People's Republic. Petliura accepted Polish control over eastern Galicia and parts of Volhynia, territories claimed by the Western Ukrainian government. This was a painful concession. Many Galician Ukrainians saw it as a betrayal. Polish and Ukrainian forces launched an offensive and captured Kyiv in May. The advance was presented as the liberation of Ukraine from Bolshevik rule, but it did not produce a broad uprising in support of Petliura. The Red Army counterattacked. Polish and Ukrainian forces retreated rapidly. Bolshevik armies moved west and approached Warsaw. For a moment, it seemed that Soviet power might spread into Central Europe. In August 1920, the Polish army defeated the Red Army near Warsaw. The battle became known as the Miracle on the Vistula. The front moved east again. Poland and Soviet Russia negotiated peace. The Treaty of Riga was signed in March 1921. Poland received western Volhynia and eastern Galicia. The remaining central and eastern Ukrainian lands formed Soviet Ukraine. The Ukrainian People's Republic was left without territory. Its government continued in exile for decades. Small groups attempted further resistance, but the organized struggle for independence had been defeated. The years of revolution left no simple ending. Several Ukrainian governments had existed. They had issued laws, created armies, opened schools, printed money, negotiated treaties, and claimed international recognition. But they had been divided, militarily weak, and surrounded by stronger powers. Social conflict had often been as important as national loyalty. Peasants wanted land and local freedom. Workers had different political loyalties. Cities and villages lived in different linguistic and social worlds. Foreign armies intervened. Disease and hunger destroyed institutions before they could become stable. Still, the experience of statehood did not disappear. The symbols, documents, military traditions, and memory of 1917 to 1917-21 would return many decades later. For the moment, however, most of Ukraine entered a new political system. The Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was formally established under Bolshevik rule. At first, Soviet Ukraine possessed the appearance of a separate state. It had its own government, borders, and official institutions. It signed some agreements and maintained limited foreign representatives. In reality, the Communist Party leadership in Moscow controlled the major decisions. In 1922, Soviet Ukraine became one of the founding republics of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Soviet Union was officially described as a voluntary federation of equal republics. Each republic had a constitutional right to leave, but power was highly centralized through the Communist Party. The tension between formal Republican sovereignty and practical central control would remain until the final days of the Soviet Union. Before that new state could stabilize, the population had to survive the aftermath of war. Industry was ruined, railways were damaged, agricultural production had collapsed, cities lacked food and fuel. The Bolsheviks had used a policy later called war communism. The state requisitioned grain from peasants, often by force. Private trade was restricted. Factories were nationalized. These measures helped supply the Red Army, but they also intensified rural resistance and economic breakdown. Peasant uprisings continued across Ukraine. Some were led by former Ottomans. Others were spontaneous local revolts. Bolshevik units responded with executions, hostage-taking, and village punishments. Drought and requisitions contributed to famine in southern Ukraine during 1900 and 1921 and 1922 too. The famine was less internationally known than the later Holodomor, but it caused enormous suffering. The Soviet government eventually accepted foreign relief, including aid from the American Relief Administration. Lenin introduced a new economic policy. Grain requisitioning was replaced by a tax. Small private businesses and trade were allowed again. Markets reopened. The economy began to recover. For a short period, Soviet life became less rigid. The 1920s also brought a striking cultural policy. The communist leadership understood that it could not govern a vast multinational state through Russian culture alone. It introduced a broader policy known as indigenization. In Soviet Ukraine, this became Ukrainization. The Ukrainian language expanded in schools, publishing, administration, and public life. Officials were encouraged to learn it. More books and newspapers appeared. Theaters and cultural institutions developed. For many Ukrainian intellectuals, the 1920s seemed to offer a chance to build modern national culture within a socialist state. Writers experimented with new styles. Poets, filmmakers, directors, and artists joined the European avant-garde. Kharkiv, then the capital of Soviet Ukraine, became a center of cultural energy. The writers' organization known as Veplight included some of the period's most ambitious authors. Mykola Kovalovy argued that Ukrainian culture should look toward Europe rather than simply copy Russian models. His phrase, "away from Moscow," expressed a cultural direction, not a simple geopolitical program. He wanted Ukrainian literature to become confident, modern, and independent in spirit. The Skurbas transformed theater through experimentation. His Borisov theater combined movement, design, music, and modern dramatic methods. Filmmaker Oleksandr Doshenko created works such as Earth, using quiet landscapes and symbolic images to portray village life and revolutionary change. His films became internationally influential. The period also saw major linguistic and academic work. Scholars developed terminology for science, law, and administration. Historians studied Ukraine within new frameworks. Schools taught millions of children in Ukrainian. The policy was never completely free. The Communist Party decided its limits. Art was expected to serve revolution. Political opposition was not tolerated. Religious institutions faced pressure. The secret police watched intellectuals. Still, the cultural space of the 1920s was much broader than what came afterward. At the same time, the Soviet government launched campaigns against religion. Orthodox, Catholic, Jewish, Protestant, and Muslim institutions all faced restrictions. Church property was confiscated. Clergy were arrested. Religious schools and organizations were closed. Propaganda presented faith as superstition and a tool of exploitation. Some people abandoned religious practice. Others continued quietly at home. Village rituals survived beneath official atheism. In western Ukraine, outside the Soviet Union, history followed a different path. Eastern Galicia and western Volhynia were incorporated into the restored Polish state. Ukrainians formed a large minority. The Polish government promised certain rights but often pursued policies of centralization and Polonization. The situation varied by region and period. Ukrainian schools faced restrictions. Polish settlers, including military veterans, received land in some eastern areas. Political conflict grew. Ukrainian parties participated in elections and built cooperatives, newspapers, youth organizations, and cultural societies. The largest legal political force became the Ukrainian National Democratic Alliance. It generally sought autonomy and national rights through political means. But a more radical movement also appeared. In 1900 and 1929, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists was founded. It brought together veterans, young activists, and underground groups. The organization believed that only disciplined revolutionary struggle could create an independent state. Its ideology was authoritarian and intensely nationalist. It treated the nation as the highest political value and accepted violence as a tool. Members carried out sabotage and assassinations against Polish officials and Ukrainians they considered collaborators. The Polish government responded with arrests, trials, and collective punishment. In 1930, a campaign known as pacification involved police and military searches, beatings, destruction of property, and closure of Ukrainian institutions in parts of Galicia. This deepened resentment and strengthened radicalism. Most Western Ukrainians did not belong to the underground nationalist movement. They continued ordinary political, religious, educational, and cooperative work. The Greek Catholic Church remained influential under Metropolitan Andrei Sheptetsky. He supported education, art, charity, and a distinct Ukrainian civic life. Western Ukraine contained competing visions of the future. There were Democrats, socialists, communists, nationalists, conservatives, and religious activists. There was no single path. In Soviet Ukraine, however, the political space was narrowing quickly. After Lenin's death, Joseph Stalin defeated his rivals and gained dominant power. By the end of the 1920s, the new economic policy was ending. Stalin's leadership launched forced industrialization. The Soviet Union aimed to transform itself rapidly from a largely agricultural country into an industrial and military power. Factories, mines, railways, dams, and new cities were built at extraordinary speed. Ukraine became central to this project. The Donbass expanded. Metallurgical plants grew. The Dnipro hydroelectric station near Zaporizhia became one of the great symbols of industrialization. Its dam was among the largest in Europe when completed. Propaganda celebrated engineers, workers, electricity, steel, and human control over nature. Many people were genuinely inspired. Young villagers moved to cities and learned technical skills. Education expanded. Women entered new professions. Industrial employment offered some a path out of traditional village limitations. But the human cost was immense. Working conditions were harsh. Production targets were often unrealistic. Accidents were common. Housing could not keep pace with population growth. Workers lived in barracks and crowded rooms. The state used coercion, surveillance, and punishment to force results. The transformation of agriculture was even more destructive. Stalin's government decided to collectivize farming. Individual peasant households were to be combined into collective farms and state farms. The state would control machinery, production plans, and grain procurement. Officials argued that collectivization would modernize agriculture and provide food for growing cities. It would also give the government tighter control over the countryside. Many peasants resisted. They had fought for land during the revolution. Now they were told to surrender animals, tools, and fields to collective institutions. Some slaughtered livestock rather than give it up. Others reduced planting, hid grain, or fled. The government identified supposedly wealthy peasants as kulaks. The term had once referred to more prosperous villagers, but during collectivization it became a flexible political label. A family could be called kulak because it owned extra animals, employed seasonal labor, resisted policy, or simply attracted the hostility of local activists. Hundreds of thousands of people in Ukraine were dispossessed. Many were deported to northern Russia, Siberia, Kazakhstan, and other distant regions. Families traveled in crowded railway wagons. Some died from cold, hunger, and disease. Those who remained faced pressure to join collective farms. By the early 1930s, most agricultural households had been collectivized. The state demanded large grain deliveries. Procurement targets often ignored real harvest conditions and local food needs. Officials searched villages for hidden supplies. They took grain, seed, and other food. Punishments were imposed on communities that failed to meet quotas. In 1932 and 1933, catastrophic famine spread across Soviet Ukraine. This famine is known as the Holodomor. The word means death inflicted by hunger. The word means death inflicted by hunger. Millions of people died. The precise number remains the subject of demographic research, but estimates for excess deaths in Soviet Ukraine commonly fall in the range of roughly 3.5 to 5 million. The famine also affected other parts of the Soviet Union, especially Kazakhstan, the North Caucasus, and regions of Russia. Kazakhstan suffered an enormous proportional loss of life during forced collectivization, yet Ukraine was subjected to specific measures that intensified starvation. Villages and districts were placed on blacklists. Trade was restricted. Food supplies were confiscated. Peasants were prevented from traveling freely in search of food. Internal passports limited movement into cities. Borders of Soviet Ukraine and the Kuban were more tightly controlled during the crisis. The state continued exporting some grain while people starved, though exports were reduced from earlier levels. Families ate whatever they could find. They ground bark and weeds, they killed pets, and searched empty fields for forgotten grain. Children stopped growing. Villages became quiet. People lacked the strength to bury the dead. Railway stations filled with those trying to escape. Many were turned back. The Soviet government denied the famine publicly. Foreign visitors were shown carefully prepared images of prosperity. Journalists who reported the truth faced pressure. The Welsh journalist Gareth Jones traveled through Soviet Ukraine and described widespread starvation. The Moscow correspondent Walter Duranty, writing for the New York Times, dismissed or minimized reports of famine while privately recognizing the scale of deaths. Soviet censorship buried the subject for decades. Was the Holodomor a genocide? Many countries and scholars recognize it as genocide against the Ukrainian people. They point to the political targeting of Ukraine, attacks on Ukrainian cultural elites, restrictions on movement, confiscation of food, and the use of starvation to break resistance. Other scholars describe it as a man-made famine and a mass crime, but debate whether the evidence proves a specific intention to destroy Ukrainians as a national group. The argument concerns legal and historical definitions. It does not change the basic fact that Soviet policy created and intensified a catastrophe that killed millions. The famine destroyed more than human lives. It broke village communities. Traditional knowledge disappeared with parents and grandparents. Survivors learned to remain silent. A person could not openly say that relatives had starved because of government actions. Official histories blamed poor harvests, kulaks, or administrative mistakes. Inside families, memories were whispered. Sometimes they were not spoken at all. At the same time, Stalin's regime attacked Ukrainian cultural and political institutions. The policy of Ukrainization was reversed. Intellectuals were accused of nationalism, espionage, and invented conspiracies. Writers, scholars, teachers, clergy, and former political activists were arrested. Mykola Kovacevic died by suicide in 1933 as repression and famine intensified. This Kurbas was arrested and later executed. Hundreds of cultural figures were killed or imprisoned. This generation became known as the executed Renaissance. The term describes the extraordinary cultural growth of the 1920s and its destruction during the 1930s. The Communist Party of Ukraine was purged. Even loyal officials who had implemented Soviet policy were accused of disloyalty. The terror expanded across the entire Soviet Union. During the Great Terror of 1937 and 1938, the secret police arrested people according to quotas and fabricated cases. Confessions were extracted through threats and torture. Some victims were accused of Ukrainian nationalism. Others were accused of Polish, German, Japanese, or Trotskyist espionage. Many charges had no connection to reality. Execution sites existed around Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa, Vinnytsia, and other cities. At Kyiv near Kyiv, thousands of victims were buried in mass graves. For decades, Soviet authorities concealed the site or blamed the killings on Nazi forces. The terror changed society. People avoided honest conversation. A careless sentence could be reported. A colleague's arrest could make everyone who knew them afraid. Children sometimes learned not to ask why a parent had disappeared. Political language became separated from private thought. Publicly, citizens praised the party and Stalin. Privately, they mourned, feared, adapted, and tried to survive. If you are still listening, you do not need to hold every detail. The history can simply move past, like a long river in darkness. By the end of the 1930s, Soviet Ukraine had changed beyond recognition. It was more urban and industrial. Literacy had risen greatly. Millions had entered schools, factories, and technical professions. But the countryside had been devastated. Independent political life had been destroyed. Cultural development existed only within strict ideological boundaries. The state was stronger than ever, and individuals were more vulnerable to it than ever. Then Europe moved toward another war. Nazi Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, sought territorial expansion and racial empire. Nazi ideology viewed Eastern Europe as land to be conquered, colonized, and exploited. Slavic populations were considered inferior. Jews were marked for exclusion and eventual destruction. The Soviet Union publicly opposed fascism, but Stalin also sought to delay war and gain territory. In August 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Officially, it was a non-aggression agreement. A secret protocol divided parts of Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September. The Soviet Union invaded from the east on the 17th of September. Poland was divided. Eastern Galicia and Western Volhynia were annexed by the Soviet Union and incorporated into Soviet Ukraine. For the first time in modern history, most Ukrainian inhabited territories were united within one political structure. But the unification came through agreement between two dictatorships and the destruction of Poland. Some local Ukrainians initially welcomed the end of Polish rule. They hoped for Ukrainian schools, land reform, or social equality. Soviet authorities did introduce Ukrainian language institutions in some areas and redistributed certain estates, but they also imposed the Soviet political system. Political parties, cooperatives, independent newspapers, and civic organizations were closed. Factories and businesses were nationalized. The Greek Catholic Church faced pressure, though it was not yet abolished. Police arrested former officials, military officers, landowners, activists, priests, and suspected nationalists. Hundreds of thousands of people from the newly annexed territories were deported to Siberia, Kazakhstan, and other regions. The deportees included Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, and others. Families were awakened at night and given little time to pack. Many did not know where they were going. In 1940, the Soviet Union also took northern Bukovina and part of Bessarabia from Romania. Northern Bukovina was added to Soviet Ukraine. Transcarpathia remained outside Soviet control, first within Czechoslovakia and then under Hungary. The borders of Ukraine were moving toward their later shape, but war was about to tear the region apart again. On the 22nd of June, 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The attack broke the non-aggression pact. German forces and their allies advanced rapidly. The Red Army suffered catastrophic losses. Millions of Soviet soldiers were surrounded and captured. In Ukraine, enormous battles took place around Kyiv, Uman, Odessa, Kharkiv, and the Donbass. The encirclement near Kyiv became one of the largest in military history. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were captured. Stalin had refused to allow a timely withdrawal. As Soviet authorities retreated, the secret police executed prisoners in several western Ukrainian cities. Bodies were found in prisons after the Soviets had left. The discoveries caused horror and anger. Nazi propaganda blamed Jews collectively for Soviet crimes, exploiting existing anti-Semitism and political resentment. This helped create an atmosphere in which new violence began. Some people greeted German forces as liberators from Stalinist rule. Their hopes disappeared quickly. Nazi occupation policy was based on exploitation, racial hierarchy, and terror. Most of Ukraine was placed under the Reichskommissariat Ukraine, administered by Erich Koch. Koch openly rejected the idea that Ukrainians deserved education or political autonomy. Other regions were controlled by military authorities, Romania, or the general government based in occupied Poland. The occupiers divided the land according to their needs. They seized food, raw materials, machinery, and labor. Millions of civilians faced hunger. Schools were limited. Villages were punished for supporting resistance. Young people were taken to Germany as forced laborers. They were known as Ostarbeiter, or Eastern workers. Around 2 million people from Ukraine were sent to work in Germany and German-controlled territories. They labored in factories, farms, mines, and private homes. Conditions varied but were often harsh. They wore identifying badges, received poor food, and had little freedom. The occupation was especially catastrophic for the Jewish population. Before the war, Soviet Ukraine contained one of the largest Jewish communities in Europe. The Nazi invasion brought the Holocaust by bullets. Mobile killing units known as Einsatzgruppen followed the army. They worked with German police, military units, and local collaborators. Jewish residents were ordered to gather. They were marched to ravines, forests, pits, or anti-tank ditches. There they were shot. In late September 1941, more than 33,000 Jews were murdered over 2 days at Babin Yar, a ravine outside Kyiv. The killings continued there afterward. Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, Ukrainian nationalists, psychiatric patients, and others were also murdered at Babin Yar. Across Ukraine, similar massacres took place. At Kamyanets-Podilsky, tens of thousands were killed. In Odessa, Romanian authorities and forces carried out mass murder. In western regions, ghettos were created before their inhabitants were deported or shot. By the end of the occupation, the majority of Jews who had remained in the territories taken by Germany and Romania had been murdered. Some local people collaborated. They served in police units, identified neighbors, guarded ghettos, or took property. Motives included anti-Semitism, nationalism, fear, coercion, careerism, and personal gain. Others rescued Jews. They hid families in cellars, barns, monasteries, and false walls. Rescue could lead to death for the helper and their relatives. Metropolitan Andrei Sheptetsky protested Nazi killings and helped hide Jewish children and religious leaders in Greek Catholic institutions. Village families, priests, workers, and officials also took risks. Most people lived between these extremes. They tried to survive, often turning away from danger. They felt powerless to stop. The organization of Ukrainian nationalists had split before the German invasion. One faction followed Andrei Melnik. Another, more radical faction followed Stepan Bandera. The Bandera faction believed the German-Soviet war created an opportunity for statehood. On the 30th of June, 1941, its members proclaimed the restoration of a Ukrainian state in Lviv. The German authorities rejected the declaration. Bandera, Yaroslav Stetsko, and other leaders were arrested. Some were later held in a special section of the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. The relationship between Ukrainian nationalists and Nazi Germany was complex and changed over time. Some nationalists initially cooperated with Germany, hoping to build military and political institutions. Members or former members of nationalist groups participated in auxiliary police formations. some of which were involved in anti-Jewish violence and operations against civilians. Later, the nationalist underground fought German forces in some regions. It also fought Soviet partisans, Polish forces, and rival Ukrainian factions. In 1942 and 1943, the Ukrainian insurgent army emerged, mainly under the influence of the Bandera faction of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. It is commonly known by its Ukrainian initials, UPA. The UPA sought an independent Ukrainian state. It operated primarily in Volhynia and Galicia. Its fighters used forests, villages, and underground networks. They fought against German occupation units at certain times. Though the scale and consistency of this conflict vary, their longest and most intense struggle was against the returning Soviet state. The UPA is also responsible for mass violence against Polish civilians in Volhynia and eastern Galicia. In 1943 and 1944, Ukrainian nationalist units and local participants attacked Polish villages. The goal was to remove the Polish population from territories claimed for a future Ukrainian state. Tens of thousands of Polish civilians were killed. Victims included women, children, and elderly people. Polish armed groups carried out retaliatory attacks against Ukrainian villages, killing thousands of Ukrainian civilians. The events are remembered in Poland as the Volhynia massacres and are often described as ethnic cleansing, sometimes as genocide. In Ukraine, public memory is often focused more heavily on the UPA's anti-Soviet struggle. A full history must hold both parts together. A movement can fight one oppressive power and still commit crimes against civilians. These truths do not cancel each other. Soviet partisans also operated in occupied Ukraine. Some units were organized by the Communist Party and security services. Others formed locally from surrounded soldiers and civilians. They attacked railways, German supply lines, police posts, and occupation officials. German forces responded with collective punishment. Entire villages could be burned after partisan attacks. In some areas, civilians faced demands from several armed groups. Partisans needed food. Nationalists needed food. German units seized food. Refusal could be dangerous no matter who was asking. The Soviet war effort gradually recovered. Factories had been evacuated eastward. New armies were raised. The battles of Moscow, Stalingrad, and Kursk weakened Germany. In 1943, the Red Army returned to eastern Ukraine. The battle for the Dnipro became one of the largest operations of the war. Soviet troops crossed the river under heavy fire. Kyiv was recaptured in November. As the front moved west, cities and villages were devastated again. German forces destroyed infrastructure during retreat. Soviet bombing and artillery caused further damage. People emerged from occupation to face investigation. The Soviet authorities questioned former prisoners of war, forced laborers, and residents who had lived under German rule. Some were suspected of collaboration simply because they had survived. Men were mobilized rapidly into the Red Army, sometimes with little training. They were sent into battle wearing incomplete uniforms and carrying limited equipment. The war ended in Europe in May 1945. For Ukraine, the human loss was almost beyond measure. Several million civilians from the territory of Ukraine had died. Millions of soldiers connected with Ukraine served in the Red Army, and a very large number were killed. The Jewish civilization that had existed across the region for centuries was largely destroyed. Towns lost entire communities. Industry, housing, farms, and transport networks lay in ruins. Exact totals vary depending on borders, categories, and methods of counting. But no major European country experienced the war without Ukraine being one of its central battlefields. The post-war borders were now close to those of modern Ukraine. Eastern Galicia and western Volhynia remained within Soviet Ukraine. Northern Bukovina also remained. Czechoslovakia ceded Transcarpathia to the Soviet Union in 1945, and it was incorporated into Soviet Ukraine. Poland and the Soviet Union exchanged populations. Hundreds of thousands of Poles were moved west from territories annexed by the Soviet Union. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians were moved from lands that remained in Poland into Soviet Ukraine. The transfers were often forced or carried out under severe pressure. Families left homes where generations had lived. In 1947, the Polish government carried out Operation Dystula. Ukrainians, Lemkos, and members of related communities were deported from southeastern Poland to western and northern territories taken from Germany. The official goal was to remove support for the UPA. Communities were scattered deliberately to encourage assimilation. In western Ukraine, the UPA continued armed resistance against Soviet rule. The Soviet security forces used infiltration, deportation, arrests, executions, and collective punishment. Families of suspected insurgents were sent to Siberia and other distant regions. Underground fighters killed Soviet officials, informants, and civilians they considered collaborators. The conflict was brutal. By the early 1950s, organized resistance had been largely defeated. The UPA commander Roman Shukhevich was killed in 1950. Small underground groups survived for several more years. The Soviet government also moved against the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. In 1946, under police pressure, a gathering in Lviv declared the church's union with Rome, dissolved, and transferred its structures to the Russian Orthodox Church. The Vatican and Greek Catholic leaders did not recognize the act. Bishops were imprisoned. Clergy who refused conversion were arrested or forced underground. For the following decades, the Greek Catholic Church survived secretly. Priests celebrated services in private homes. Children were baptized quietly. Religious books were hidden. This underground network became one of the largest prohibited religious communities in the Soviet Union. Reconstruction began under Stalin's harsh post-war system. Factories were rebuilt quickly. Coal and steel production received priority. Consumer needs received less attention. People lived in damaged buildings and temporary shelters. Food remained scarce. A severe famine affected parts of Ukraine in 1946 and 1946. In 1947, drought contributed, but state grain procurement and exports intensified the crisis. Western regions were collectivized later than central and eastern Ukraine. Peasants resisted giving up land and livestock. By the early 1950s, collectivization had been imposed across nearly the entire republic. Political repression continued. Wartime prisoners, suspected collaborators, nationalists, religious believers, and ordinary people accused of disloyalty filled prisons and labor camps. Yet the post-war period also brought education, urban growth, and social mobility. Children from villages entered technical schools and universities. Industrial centers expanded. New apartment districts appeared. The Russian language gained influence in cities, science, administration, and prestigious careers. Ukrainian remained widely spoken, especially in villages and western regions, but its public position was uneven. In 1953, Stalin died. His death did not immediately end the Soviet system, but it opened a period of change. Nikita Khrushchev gradually emerged as the leading figure. Khrushchev had spent important years working in the Communist Party organization of Ukraine. He knew the republic's leadership and had participated in Stalinist policies. In 1956, he delivered a secret speech condemning some of Stalin's crimes and the cult of personality. The speech did not reject the communist system. It placed much of the blame on Stalin personally. Still, it shocked party members. Prisoners began returning from labor camps. Some victims were rehabilitated. Censorship became slightly less rigid. This period became known as the Thaw. Writers and artists explored subjects that had been dangerous before. Young Ukrainian cultural figures known as the 60ers appeared. They included poets, painters, critics, filmmakers, and human rights activists. Among them were Lena Kostenko, Vasil Simonenko, Ivan Rok, Ela Horska, Ivan Spit.